I suppose it depends on what spaces we want the European Union to enter. And I mean, I'm coming from the perspective of a human rights organization. We've had huge international support for rights within a peace process, but the vast majority of that has come from the Council of Europe and the United Nations mechanisms, not from the EU. And I suppose it depends on how much we want the EU to further enter into the space of rights and the space of enforcing the rule of law. And in our context, that would involve trying to enforce the rule of law and human rights in a third country, in terms of the UK's responsibilities. And we all know the risks and pitfalls of that. That there is a risk externally that the EU will be rather selective in how it enforces those types of standards with its allies and with its enemies. And I suppose to give examples of some of the recent rights deficits that we've been facing that do have a cross-border dimension, one of them is dealing with the question of impunity for human rights violations during the Northern Ireland conflict, killings, torture, collusion with paramilitary groups, and those things. There was a bilateral agreement between the British and Irish governments for transitional justice mechanisms to deal with that, and an existing package of measures, an existing set of mechanisms set up as a result of cases taken by ourselves and others to the European Court of Human Rights. And this will surprise no one, the government of Boris Johnson, when it came in, simply tore those agreements up, and tried to legislate for a blanket amnesty that was actually originally going to be broader in scope than General Pinochet's amnesty. That, and even its sanitized version, was found to be unlawful by the courts. But they have succeeded in closing down all of those spaces, largely to control the narrative of the conflict. There's an official version of what happened, and that official version was getting increasingly damaged by independent investigations through the courts or through other mechanisms. In that context, we've had huge intervention from the Council of Europe mechanisms and from the United Nations mechanisms, which has been incredibly helpful, and silence from the European Union. It's despite all of the post-Brexit mechanisms. In another area that's relevant to the peace process that I mentioned earlier on, minoritized language rights, in terms of the Irish language. Again, Irish is an official language of the EU. It's still very marginalized in Northern Ireland because of the historical marginalization and the sort of prohibition from public space for a lot of years. Again, we've only made progress in that through the Council of Europe treaties and mechanisms and some of the UN mechanisms. Some of the European Charter for Regional Minority Languages was signed up as a result of the peace settlement. We've a lot of intervention from the Council of Europe in that area, which again is an area around rights deficits that are relevant to a cross-border pattern. So it really depends as to whether we would want the EU to enter into those spaces and whether we could trust them, given the control of states, to play a progressive role in those spaces when we've already got the other mechanisms within the UN system and the Council of Europe system doing that.